Welcome back to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we're plunging into something pretty profound, a phenomenon that really challenges our understanding of life, death, consciousness itself, near-death experiences. NDEs.
Hmm.
So for this deep dive, we've pulled together, well, quite a fascinating stack of sources. We've got rigorous scientific papers looking right into the brain.
Yeah, the hard science attempt.
Exactly. Then there are these in-depth interviews with people who've actually had these experiences
The first-hand accounts.
and incredibly raw personal stories shared on places like online forums.
It's a really diverse mix, isn't it?
Right.
It gives us NDEs from, well, pretty much every angle of the clinical trying to measure and explain,
Right.
right alongside the intensely personal journey, often world-altering for the person.
Absolutely. So our mission today, it's pretty straightforward, based only on what these sources are telling us. We're going to try and unpack what NDEs are, explore the, frankly, astonishing experiences people report, dig into the potential explanations being proposed, and really understand the profound, often permanent ways these moments transform lives. Let's get to the core insights from this stack.
All right, let's dive right in then. At its core, what exactly is a near-death experience based on the material we looked at?
Well, the sources define an NDE as a profound subjective experience. It happens during a life-threatening crisis or, when death seems imminent.
Okay.
And it's characterized by what they often call transcendental elements, aspects that feel like they're beyond our normal physical or psychological reality.
And the things people report,
Yeah.
they seem to show these remarkable patterns, don't they? Like that feeling, that sense of being separate from your physical body.
They absolutely do. Out-of-body experiences, OBEs, they're incredibly common in these accounts.
Right.
People describe feeling, well, severed from their physical body, sometimes floating above it, seeing themselves from, say, the ceiling.
And what's really striking is the awareness they report having. Awareness of their surroundings, things happening in the room, even when they were, medically unconscious or unresponsive.
That's one of those details that it really makes you pause, doesn't it? We saw that Reddit story, the person who had an NDE as a child.
Yeah.
Scarlet fever, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And they vividly recalled seeing their own small body being held by their crying mother, but seeing it from way up near the ceiling. That level of detail is...
It's compelling, yeah. And then there's often a sense of a journey. The tunnel experience is almost a classic element.
Yes.
Passing through or
Thus-
seeing a tunnel. Sometimes it's described as dark, but often it has these really positive feelings attached. Warm, friendly, inviting. One source even described it as glowing white gold.
Leading towards. Is it usually a bright light?
Yes. Encountering a bright light is another very frequently reported element.
Mm-hmm.
And then people often find themselves in, well, other environments.
Different places.
Yeah. The sources mention heavenly scenes seem to come up more often than, say, frightening or hellish ones. Sometimes these almost utopian Arcadian landscapes, lush, peaceful, maybe with joyful people. One account specifically mentioned flying over green countryside, seeing kids laughing.
And they often meet other beings there, too.
Correct. Very frequently, these are deceased loved ones. Parents, grandparents, best friends show up in these accounts. Sometimes they encounter more general figures described as angelic or maybe just other consciousnesses, spirits.
And how do they communicate? Is it spoken?
Usually not, no. It's often described as telepathic. A direct transfer of thoughts or, and this seems crucial, emotions. Anita Morjani, whose account was quite detailed in our sources.
Right. Her story is well known.
She described communicating with her deceased father and her best friend purely through thought and feeling. No words needed.
The emotional side sounds just as powerful as the visual descriptions.
Oh, overwhelmingly so. A core feeling that comes through again and again is this intense peace and tranquility. Anita Morjani described it as superb and glorious unconditional love. Feeling totally immersed in it, feeling it was completely undiscriminating, like you didn't have to earn it.
Wow.
And any severe physical pain or discomfort that the person was feeling right before the NDE, it just seems to vanish instantly.
But it's not always this bliss and peace, is it? I mean, the sources did mention some negative experiences, too.
They did, yes. Though they do seem less common, at least in the reports we reviewed. These can involve things like distorted faces, screaming, real lack of calm.
Scary stuff.
Yeah, or even encounters interpreted as negative figures, like the devil in one account. But, interestingly, some sources suggested these frightening experiences can sometimes be seen as warnings.
Warnings.
Yeah, sometimes prompting a life review or some intense self-analysis that actually still leads to profound positive change afterwards. So even the scary ones could be transformative.
Okay, so beyond the sensory stuff and the emotions, the cognitive aspects, these are maybe the most counterintuitive, right? Given the person's physical state.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Despite being in these life-threatening conditions where you'd absolutely expect confusion or disorientation.
Right, like oxygen deprivation or trauma.
Exactly.
Yeah.
NDEs consistently report hyper-clear awareness and alertness. They describe a state of complete clarity. Like suddenly, everything makes perfect sense.
A sudden, profound understanding, like a download of information.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And a major part of this is often the life review.
Ah, the life flashing before your eyes thing.
It's more than just flashing, according to these accounts. People see their entire life unfolding, but they gain this incredible perspective on their motivations, their life path. Anita Moorjani described seeing her life like a tapestry and understanding how her patterns, especially things like people-pleasing and betraying herself, had actually contributed to her illness. It's not just watching a movie, it's watching with this deep insight into cause and effect.
So it's less about just seeing the events and much more about understanding them on a really deep level.
Precisely. There's also often a reported sense of understanding everything, a feeling of connection to the universe, or some universal energy, feeling one with everyone.
Wow.
And the normal constraints of time, they often feel dissolved or just cease to matter. That altered sense of time comes up a lot.
We had some specific stories in the sources that really, brought these experiences to life.
We did. Besides Anita Moorjani's really powerful story of overcoming terminal cancer after her NDE,
Yeah.
there was that Reddit account of the child seeing their mother crying from the feeling this pull to return. Another user, dealing with a brain tumor, described hallucinations that felt utterly real, including seeing their deceased mother reliving cherished memories. It felt like weeks passing in just moments, which highlights that altered time sense, again described as both calming and terrifying in that case.
And a car accident one.
Right, the car accident survivor who saw that white gold tunnel and was clearly presented with a choice to return or stay. Yes, a conscious choice. And they ultimately decided to come back, specifically for their family and pets. The point is, these aren't just vague dreams. They often feel incredibly vivid, detailed, intensely real, and deeply purposeful to the person experiencing them.
Okay, so given these, often extraordinary subjective reports, how do researchers and scientists even begin to try and understand what's happening here?
Well, science obviously turns to its tools. Things like EEG, electroencephalogram, measuring brain waves, and fMRI, which measures brain activity. They use these to look at potential neural and physiological mechanisms.
So what are they finding?
Some studies suggest involvement of both higher-order brain regions, the complex thinking parts, and also deeper subcortical structures. They're also looking very closely at changes in neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers in the brain, especially during extreme stress or crisis.
And did the sources mention specific chemicals? Any leads there?
Yes, definitely. Research cited showed significant surges in several neurotransmitters, like adenosine, norepinephrine, GABA, glutamate, aspartate, particularly in brain areas during asphyxia, so severe oxygen deprivation. And serotonin, which is really key for mood and perception, showed a particularly dramatic increase, up to maybe 20 times baseline in the first couple of minutes of a crisis.
20 times, wow.
And some animal studies cited suggested potentially up to 250 times baseline after that initial period. Huge surges.
So is the thinking in the scientific community, or at least parts of it, that these chemical floods or maybe specific brain activities like certain brain waves or states related to sleep, is that what the NDE is?
Those are certainly proposed explanations that the sources explore. Ideas involving things like REM intrusion, elements of dream sleep bleeding into wakefulness, or specific gamma oscillations, a type of brainwave activity. But the scientific papers we looked at, they're actually quite careful. They emphasize that current, purely physiological explanations don't seem to singularly account for everything. They don't fully explain the wide variability, the complex narrative structure, and especially that incredibly clear consciousness that people report during the NDE.
So still big question marks there from a purely brain-based view.
Exactly. Many unanswered questions remain if you only look at it through that lens.
Which I guess naturally leads to a really fascinating comparison. How do these NDE reports stack up against experiences that are induced by other means, like, say, certain substances?
That's precisely what some studies have investigated, yeah. Particularly comparing NDE narratives to psychedelic experiences.
How do they even compare written stories like that?
They use techniques like semantic similarity analysis. It's basically a way to measure how similar the meaning or the concepts are in different written reports.
Okay, and what did they find?
They found that NDE narratives show the highest semantic similarity to experiences induced by two main classes of substances: dissociatives, like ketamine,
Ah, okay.
and, importantly, serotonergic psychedelics. That group includes things like DMT, LSD, and psilocybe mushrooms.
So things like feeling disconnected from your usual self, or that feeling of being completely connected to everything, or having these profound mystical insights, those kinds of things show up in both NDEs and certain psychedelic trips.
That's the key finding from that research, yes. Concepts like ego dissolution, that sense of the boundary between yourself and the world just dissolving.
Right.
The unit of experience feeling interconnected one with the universe.
Yeah.
The oceanic feeling merging with something bigger, and various other mystical aspects. These are common across NDEs in these specific psychedelic states.
Interesting. I know some theories focus specifically on DMT, suggesting the brain produces it.
Yeah, the DMT model gets mentioned. But the research we looked at actually highlighted that this similarity isn't unique to DMT. It extends to other serotonergic psychedelics too. It suggests maybe a broader link related to that serotonin system, rather than just one specific substance being the sole explanation.
Okay, so moving beyond the strictly biological or chemical lens, what about looking at NDEs psychologically?
Psychology offers some interesting perspectives too. For instance, connecting that ego dissolution we just talked about to potential increases in empathy and social harmony afterwards. There's research cited suggesting that link. NEEs are also sometimes viewed through the framework of psychological theories of ego development, particularly theories like Jane Lovinger's stages.
Lovinger's stages, how does that relate specifically to NDEs? Could you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Lovinger's theory basically maps how people develop their understanding of themselves, their relationships, the world, moving from simpler, more self-focused views to more complex, integrated understandings. One paper we reviewed proposed that NDEs might actually facilitate shifts towards higher, more sophisticated, post-conventional levels of ego development. Like it could accelerate that process.
Post-conventional meaning?
Meaning moving beyond purely societal norms or expectations towards more universal principles and a more integrated sense of self. They even suggested a link to Lovinger's theoretical stage 6.
Stage 6.
Which she described as recognizing a kind of universal, inclusive environment, unifying your life and self. This supposedly enables the individual to live more authentically and even help transform things around them, even if the world itself hasn't changed. It's about inner transformation enabling outer action.
That's a powerful way to frame the potential psychological shift, isn't it? And all this inevitably brings us to some of the really deep philosophical questions these experiences poke at.
Absolutely, inevitably. NDEs push us right into the heart of the mind-body debate. Is consciousness purely a product of the brain and its chemistry, the materialist view? Or is it something more fundamental, maybe even separate? While some scientific perspectives in the sources definitely lean towards the purely brain-generated experience, others acknowledge that NDEs present really complex data that just doesn't easily fit within our current materialist models.
And there was a critique in some of the sources, wasn't there, about how traditional science has sometimes approached these more subjective, spiritual-like phenomena?
Yes, one paper was quite pointed about it. It suggested that secular science carries a kind of original sin.
Original sin.
Yeah, like a historical legacy stemming from past conflicts, maybe between science and religion, and this legacy leads it to sort of a priori disregard or dismiss subjective and spiritual experiences rather than just observing them objectively.
So dismissing them before even looking closely.
That's the argument, that this limits our understanding. And they called for a reappraisal of the ruling scientific paradigms, especially when we're faced with consistent, compelling subjective data like NDE reports. It's basically a call for science to perhaps be more open, more willing to look at phenomena it can't yet fully explain or easily measure.
A call for open-minded observation, really. And the NDEs themselves, they often use analogies, don't they, to try and describe how their perception shifts afterwards.
They do. Like that really powerful radio analogy from one of the Reddit accounts we saw.
How did that go?
They described ordinary perception as being like tuning a radio to just one single frequency. You only hear that one station. But experiencing an NDE is like suddenly realizing that all the frequencies are broadcasting simultaneously.
Wow.
That there's infinitely more reality, more consciousness existing than we typically perceive in our normal everyday state. It fundamentally changes how they view the world and their own place within it.
Okay, so given everything we've discussed, these shared elements, the deep feelings, the cognitive clarity, the scientific puzzles, the comparison to other states. What does this all mean for the people who actually go through an NDE? The sources are really clear that these aren't just fleeting moments. They lead to profound, often permanent changes.
They really are life-altering. One of the most consistent findings across the board is a strong shift in fundamental values.
How does that usually manifest? What kind of shift?
Well, there's often an intensified sense of compassion and this feeling of unconditional love, not just receiving it, but wanting to give it. Materialism, competitiveness, that focus on external achievements tends to significantly lessen. People report increased spirituality or a deep inner religious feeling. Now, the specific definition of God might stay personal or even vague.
Right.
But a belief in some form of continued existence or a higher consciousness seems almost universal for people after an NDE. Any childhood fears or guilt they might have had around religion often just disappear. And crucially, many feel this powerful sense of mission afterwards, a real desire to be of service to others, and just a profound appreciation for life itself, recognizing it as this precious gift. Anita Moorjani really emphasized that realizing that life is the gift.
It sounds like a fundamental reorientation of their inner compass almost.
It really is. And alongside that, there's often a realization of their magnificent being, as one source put it, or their true, authentic self. This often leads to deep regret over past behavior like people-pleasing or times they betrayed themselves. They learn to value themselves more, to live more authentically, standing up for their needs and beliefs.
So less driven by pleasing others or fitting in.
Exactly. They describe functioning less from the ego, surrendering more to what feels like a higher purpose or calling, and finding that the fear, especially the fear of letting go or even facing death again, diminishes significantly. Conscious-driven motivation becomes less primary. There's a profound sense of knowing what's real and finding deep contentment in just being.
These huge internal shifts must translate into pretty significant external behavioral changes too, right?
Oh, absolutely. For one, they often become more open and willing to discuss things like death, existential questions, topics many people shy away from.
Yeah.
Some deep and existing spiritual practices, like the NPR interview mentions someone praying regularly after their NDE, which they hadn't done before. Others explore entirely new spiritual paths.
And careers?
Lifestyles, major lifestyle changes are common, yeah, including leaving professions altogether or finding that previous competitive goals just seem completely meaningless now. We saw examples in the sources. Former police officers who, after an NDE, felt they could no longer use their weapon.
Yeah.
Or business people who just lost all interest in climbing the corporate ladder, especially if it meant getting ahead at others' expense.
Yeah.
The whole game changes for them.
These transformations sound incredible, almost universally positive in the long run, but they must also come with some pretty significant challenges, especially at first.
They absolutely do. That's a really important point in the sources. A major struggle for NDErs is integrating this massive experience back into ordinary, everyday life.
How so?
Well, it can be incredibly isolating. It's difficult when you feel you've glimpsed this vast interconnected reality, but the people around you, your friends, your family, they don't share that perspective. They can't see what you've seen.
That flashlight analogy again.
Exactly. Knowing so much more exists than others can see with their sort of limited beam, it can lead to feeling deeply misunderstood, alone, even alienated sometimes.
And that must put a strain on relationships.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
The sources do mention that personal partnerships, even marriages, sometimes end. It happens because the NDErs' fundamental values and life priorities have shifted so dramatically that they're just no longer compatible with their partners.
That's tough.
It is. And this whole integration process, it isn't instant. It can take a really long time. One account speculated it might take around 7 years, possibly linking it, maybe metaphorically, to the body's cellular turnover cycles. It takes time to embody the changes.
It's fascinating, though, to consider the broader implications of these widespread, apparently consistent transformations that people report.
The sources definitely touch on this. They introduce this idea that NDErs, with their shared values, love, compassion, service, interconnectedness, might actually prefigure a kind of new stage in human potential or evolution.
A new stage.
Yeah. One source even suggested a term like homo noeticus, meaning knowing man, or maybe intuitive man.
Homo noeticus.
The idea, or maybe the hope, is that these values, if they became more widespread, could act as a kind of social solvent, promoting peace, interconnectedness, taking precedence over purely materialistic or competitive drives, potentially leading to broader positive social change. It's a pretty bold idea about the potential ripple effect of these individual experiences.
So thinking about all this, for you listening to our deep dive today, how does exploring these accounts, these scientific probes, these philosophical questions, how does it resonate with your own thoughts about consciousness or identity or maybe just the nature of reality itself?
What really stands out, I think, from digging into this stack of sources is just the consistent report of profound clarity and transformation happening in states that are clearly outside our ordinary everyday consciousness.
Yeah.
They really do present a significant challenge to some conventional scientific paradigms.
Yeah.
And they strongly suggest that our everyday perception might just be, a fraction of what's actually accessible or real. There might be much more going on.
And while we've pulled out some incredible insights today, there are still so many unresolved questions swirling around NDEs, questions the sources themselves highlight.
Oh, definitely. Big questions remain. Like,
Yeah.
does an NDE actually change a person's predetermined fate or life trajectory? Is destiny altered?
Yep.
Some accounts raise really mind-bending ideas, like in one Reddit thread, about whether a consciousness or a soul might actually sort of inhabit or even take over a body during these moments.
Oh.
Yeah, and some NDE accounts even touch on concepts like pre-birth planning, the idea that we might choose aspects of our lives before we're born.
Right.
And then there's the ongoing question, even though the sources suggest many common core elements across cultures, how much, if at all, does a person's specific cultural or religious background shape the content, the specific imagery or figures they see, or maybe just the interpretation they give to their experience afterwards versus the core phenomena themselves? That's still debated.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given these consistent reports we've explored, the clarity, the sense of unity, the profound positive transformation associated with near-death experiences, what might it mean for our understanding of human potential? If these remarkable states, the ones accessed during an NDE, are actually, in some sense, accessible or maybe even inherent to consciousness itself, perhaps waiting to be discovered or cultivated, even without facing death, even in ordinary life.